That's good. Share screen, Google Chrome. More chat. There we are. All right, hello everybody. Welcome to day 5 of game theory. We're almost done. Next time is our last class. So that's gonna be fun. Yeah, this went by quickly. Today we're going to talk about strategic moves, which are pretty interesting, and I haven't really discussed what they are before, so I'll have to define them now. So yeah, let's get started. So what is a strategic move? So again, the nice Wikipedia definition is an action taken by a player outside the defined actions of the game in order to gain strategic advantage and increase one's payoff. In other words, it's a move one makes before the game even starts to get something or other, like either to change their payoffs or in order to force the other player to make some moves that benefit them, right? So I'm going to be using Uno for all my examples. So does everybody know what Uno is? I just want to, because I mean, it's not super bad if somebody doesn't know Uno, because I'm not using like super extreme examples. So. I don't see anyone saying no. So I'm going to assume that we're fine. Yeah, I know what reverse card is. Okay, so then, yeah. So an example of a strategic move is player A and player B are both in a game of Uno, and player A threatens player B that if player B skips them, then on the next turn around, player A will use a +4 card on player B. So does everybody understand this very basic definition? It's just as long a strategic move is something that occurs before the game happens, so that some people will try to coerce other players into acting to do something else, or maybe to change their payoff somehow. So does that definition make sense? See one yeah. Let's get a few more yeahs. Is that like choosing college or career in life? Again, you have to define how that's a game. I mean, maybe, but I'm just gonna say no, because that's a bit weirdly not specific, but not applicable to this. I can't. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. Okay, so next question. You set up rules that are not part of the rules of the game, but just IRL. It's kind of hard to explain in words. So we have our game, and then this is like a pre-game. It's actually pretty easy to explain the rules. Yeah, the strategic moves are kind of outside of the usual game, but they're pretty easy. They're easy to define, actually. So it's not as hard as one might think to define. Like a fork in chess. A fork is just a tie, right? So I'm not sure what a fork is in chess words. A strategic move always takes place before the actual game occurs. So I'm not sure a fork would work. I mean, so no, a fork isn't that, because remember, the game of chess is its own thing. So a strategic move would be done before the game of chess in order for like the one player to gain an advantage. Like an example of strategic move for chess is before the chess match begins, the first player says to the second player, if you win, I'm going to beat you up, right? That's a good example of strategic move, because that's not actually in chess, but outside of the chess game, before that, then the person is making the strategic move. If you win, you might get a bit of payoff from winning, but if you do, I'm going to punch you and it's going to hurt. So that's another example of strategic move. Anything else? Let's refrain from talking about Valorant, simply because. So the reason Valorant doesn't really have strategic moves is because you can't. I mean, and a lot of games, I guess, is because before the game, a lot of online games, before the game starts, you can't really interact. Is that better? I don't know how this mic even works. Am I louder now? Okay, yeah, but yeah, only not cool people use game chat. But before, like, before the game, maybe you say some mean stuff in the game chat, and that's an example of strategic move. But if you're in a game where there's no microphones, then maybe you can't say anything, right? Then there is no strategic move. You guys are using slang I don't even know. Let's okay, let's stay out of video games because you guys are talking about games I don't play. I'm gonna move on. Okay, so there's a few requirements for a strategic move to like work at all. So we're just gonna quickly go over them. So first of all, the strategic move needs to be observable. Player B cannot see that player A has made a strategic move, then player B can't really react to the strategic move, and thus for player B, nothing happened. So if player A makes an Uno threat, but in Japanese, and player B doesn't speak Japanese, player B won't react to the threat, and from player B side, there was no threat ever made in the first place. Okay, so the second requirement for a strategic move is it needs to be irreversible, right? Player B may suspect that player A may back out and will anticipate that you'll do this, right? So it's like assuming you are uncommitted, then they'll assume that you'll not commit to whatever and then back out. Yeah. So if they think you're bluffing, then they're going to act like no threat was ever made, right? Exactly. So an example of this is if player B thinks that player A doesn't actually might say that he's going to use a +4, but player B thinks that player A might not do it, then the threat is meaningless and player A will continue playing on, right? So these are the two requirements for strategic moves. So what are some strategic moves you guys can think of that fit this criteria? And what do you think are some not so good strategic moves? And say which one. Like a good strategic move and then a bad strategic move. Anything at all? It's not easy, but just anything, because it'll help. Yeah, so maybe before some strategic moves are like in war, like IR, in real life war. So yeah, maybe before some battle begins, this is a good example, right? So there's this story about, so um, there's these two countries and they're fighting, and then one decides to attack the other country, right? So then they make a threat saying, if you do this, then we're going to do that and retaliate, right? That's an example of strategic move. So if that country makes it observable, like they make it obvious to the other country that this is going to happen, and maybe if the other country, yeah, it needs to be, again, irreversible. Yeah. So yeah, war is a pretty good example. I'm going to assume that's an Uno threat in Japanese. The next thing after that. But yeah, threatening to go to war if you attack an ally. Telling people you have a knight card in Catan. So the reason that's not quite a strategic move, I mean, it might be, but simply telling somebody doesn't really carry any weight, right? It's not credible, which is the next thing we're going to talk about. So I'm going to move on. So the unspoken rule of strategic moves is, so actually, never mind. So there's two kinds of strategic moves. There's unconditional and there's conditional. So player A says that they will choose a specific option no matter what player B chooses, right? So in our Uno example, player A says that they'll use, player A says that they will use the +4 card no matter what, right? So no matter what player B does, player A says, I'm going to use the +4 card, so you better make it better for yourself somehow. And an example of a conditional threat, strategic move, not threat, conditional strategic move is, so player A says that if player B chooses Y1, then player A will choose option X1. If player B chooses option Y2, then player A will choose option X2, etc., etc. So an example of this for Uno is player A says that they will use the +4 card only if player B skips them. So remember, a strategic move happens before the game. So a lot of that's one thing you have to be sure of. Strategic moves always take place before the game occurs and are defined outside of the rules. So bluffing is like, it might be included in a sequential game. So using the Uno reverse card in itself isn't a strategic move. Threatening someone with an Uno reverse card might be. No, because I don't know what that means in this case. So, but yeah, so yeah, so in that case, the reason, so if you make a move in the middle of a game, so I'm actually going to go back. So saying when you, are you sure? So that might be a strategic move, but you have to be more specific than that. Strategic moves have very specific language, and this is the specific language. So if you do this, I'll do that. If you do this, I'll do that. If you do this, I'll do that is conditional. I'll do this no matter what is unconditional. So you need to be more specific when you're creating a strategic move. The wording is very important. Otherwise, you just have to be careful when you're defining it to make sure it's actually a strategic move. Yeah, so I had a good example in Commander in Magic the Gathering is saying, if you play your rags to riches, I'm going to negate it, right? Because, so that's a strategic move. Now the person has to consider, are they going to, play their revel in, not rags to riches, revel in riches. So yeah, that was a funny Magic the Gathering joke. Not really, wasn't that funny. But yeah, so any more examples? Conditional. If you don't trade that brick, I'll play the knights, block your wheat, and steal the brick. So, okay, so the thing about, so people are getting on this very important thing. Like in card games, there's asymmetric information, right? So what do you do in that case? Well, this is our third point of notice, credibility, right? So for a player to take action, do a strategic move, the strategic move needs to be credible, right? So you need to be credible enough for the other person to believe that you are going to do what you are intending to do, right? So I can say, oh, I'm going to do this, but if I'm often lying about that, the other person might not believe me and will go through with it anyway. So credibility is incredibly important about this. If you steal my Pokemon cards, I'll break your face. That's a very good example of a conditional thing. But the thing about, I'm going to go back very quickly. Yep. So the thing about conditional moves is that when you make a strategic move, so let's go back to this example. If you steal my Pokemon cards, I'll break your face, right? So the thing about that is that that statement by itself isn't technically a strategic move. You also need to have some more sentences describing in other scenarios, right? So while in language it is implied that the second part of that is, if you don't steal my Pokemon cards, I won't break your face. In game theory, that needs to be said explicitly, right? You can't just say that. You have to say, if you do this, then I'll do that. But that's not enough. You have to say, if you do this, I'll do that. If you do this, I'll do that, right? If you don't steal my Pokemon cards, I won't break your face. But if you do steal my Pokemon cards, I will break your face. That's a strange example, but it works. It does work. That's a good example. So yeah. So if you're ever making a strategic move, be careful not to leave anything implied. Make sure to say everything up front. So yeah. So I just forgot to say that, but that's pretty important. So let's go back to credibility. That's a very important thing I need to talk about. So anyway, so as I said, just stating something doesn't have any proof. So this is because there is no real cost to just saying, hey, if you do this, I'll do that, right? What's going to happen, right? You don't lose anything by saying something. If you're going to make a strategic move, you need to be able to prove that like you have to be like losing something a little bit if the strategic move goes through. So, but simply saying something does have a word, and it's called cheap talk. And again, talking doesn't have any value. That's why it's called cheap talk. It doesn't cost anything payoffs wise. So in some games, cheap talk is useful for coordination, but not for a lot of games. But such games in which cheap talk is useful are said to have a cheap talk equilibrium. So let's go back to who remembers what this game is called? Review from the last class before last. Who remembers what this game is called? If you weren't here, yeah, no, not Prisoner's Dilemma. Simultaneous, yeah, it's a simultaneous game, but which one? This isn't a very easy one to remember. The tennis one, yeah, that's a good example. It does have a Nash equilibrium. Yeah, it does have two Nash equilibrium exactly. So I mean, this one's called assurance. So, sorry, you missed the lesson about this, so you might be a bit confused. But this one's called assurance, and if you remember, both player A and player B are choosing what to do. If they both play tennis, they get a good payoff. If they both go to coffee, they get a small payoff, but they still get some stuff. But if they do separate things, then it's not that good, right? So they have these two Nash equilibria. Yeah, exactly, swim and run. So, but the thing about this is that we can introduce cheap talk as a strategic move, right? So before they choose what to do, they simply communicate with each other, right? Like, hey, let's do tennis because that's good for us. So then they both choose tennis. So remember last time when we said that while it's pretty obvious that they both choose tennis, we can't really say that. But with the help of strategic moves, we can say that. With cheap talk equilibrium, because this one's obviously better, we can say that this is now the outcome that's going to occur, right? So this is while there's two Nash equilibria, there's only one cheap talk equilibrium. So another example in which cheap talk equilibrium is used is just pure coordination, which if you remember is as long as both players choose the same thing, then they both get the same payoff, right? In that case, there's still two cheap talk equilibria because they still have the same values, but because they can talk at the beginning, they know that they'll get at least one of the two Nash equilibria, if you remember what that is. So cheap talk equilibrium really only exists in games in which both players have interests that like work together. They have aligned interests, right? Because in this game, both players can agree that they want to go to tennis, and in pure coordination, both players can agree, you know, we need to do one thing or the other, but we need to do it together, right? But suppose we do, yeah, like trading in Catan. It's good for both of you, for example. I mean, in like, not a great, actually, I mean, yeah, kind of, it's a good example. Trading Catan isn't super good for a game, but in the end, because they have aligned interests, it's good for both, and it's a good example. Yeah, it's an okay example. I'm still thinking about it a bit. So if you remember what Battle of the Sexes is, like there's two Nash equilibria, but one Nash equilibria is good for player A and one Nash equilibria is good for player B. There is no cheap talk equilibria, right? Because they're these two Nash equilibria, their interests aren't aligned. So they won't be able to agree on stuff, right? So there's no there's no cheap talk equilibrium there. So for cheap talk equilibrium to exist, interests must be at least partially aligned. So yeah. So let's talk about unconditional strategic moves, or what are otherwise known as commitments. So no matter what player B does, player A will always choose the same option. That's the definition. So, but if it's completely credible, it changes player B's scenario from a game into a decision. So our example is player A says that they will use the +4 card no matter what, right? So what are some examples of other commitments in, for games? So right before something occurs, you make a commitment. Did you really not hear me? Is this louder? Okay, yeah, I will use my knight card in Catan. That's a good example. No matter what you do, I'm going to do this, right? That's a good example. Another example, I will rob you. So in Monopoly, you can say that you will buy the person's property. That's not a very good example of, so the reason that's not a commitment per se, that's super weird. Okay. Is that better? I don't know how this works. What? What was that? Oh my. What the heck is? I have no idea.
You're muted.
You have been mute.
Yeah, I'm aware. Sorry, some weird stuff just happened. That was very bad. Sorry, some very strange things happened. Give me a second. I truthfully have no idea what happened. All right, I guess we're back. Oh boy. Sorry about that, everybody. All right, so I'm sorry if you can't hear me. I don't know how to fix that, so so anyway, I genuinely have no idea what's going on. So yeah, we went through this slide, right? We did this. I got nice examples. Choose Zoom speaker audio. Sometimes it gets set to low sometimes.
No, she meant him, not you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Anyway, so somebody. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to the example I was talking about before all of this happened. Where is it? So the example was Monopoly, right? I will buy your property. So the reason that's like not a great commitment is because if somebody already owns that property, you can't really force them to like give them your property. You can say, I'm going to ask for your property no matter what. It's not a very useful commitment, but I mean, that's a commitment, right? So you need to be able to do it. Yeah. So, but let's talk about a pretty interesting use of this, in my opinion. Chicken. Who remembers what chicken is? Cars. Animal. The poultry species game. Yeah, so Chicken is a game. So the real life version of Chicken is that there's these two cars, right? And they're on a one lane road. And they're going towards each other at however many miles per hour. And whoever swerves, they obviously don't want to get in a crash. So whoever swerves loses a bit of honor. So that's the -1 payoff. And whoever doesn't swerve is cool. So they get a +1 payoff. If both swerve, nothing happens. But if they collide, they get in a car accident, and that's not bad. So yeah, so that's a very bad outcome of -10. So let's step into the shoes of player A, right? So player A can make a commitment, right? I'm going to go straight. So so let's remember our things about strategic moves. It needs to be observable, it needs to be irreversible, and it needs to be credible. So credible is kind of a weird thing, so we have to kind of think about that. But let's think about observable and irreversible. So one easy way to do both of these at the same time is to just throw the steering wheel out the window, right? You can, in a car, it's pretty, not easy, but if you have a screwdriver, it's not super hard to remove the steering wheel, right? Just take it out and throw it out the window. So this is observable because if you throw it out the window, player B is going to see it, right? Oh, that's the steering wheel. And it's irreversible because it's kind of hard to recover your steering wheel after you've thrown it out the window. So now player B only has to make a decision, right? Because player A is going to go straight no matter what. Player B has to choose between swerving or going straight. So if they swerve, they get a payoff of -1, but if they go straight, they get a payoff of -10. So they're pretty obviously going to go straight as to avoid a collision. So this is probably the most useful example of a commitment. So now, like a good example in mind. Any more? Any questions about this at all? Anything? I've not been asking for questions, but are there any questions? No. We assume that if they swerve, then they don't. If they both swerve, then they swerve opposite directions. That's remember, they both get a payoff of 0, so they don't collide if that happens. So any other questions? All right, so let's move on. Okay, so conditional strategic moves, which are threats and promises. So a threat is a response rule that leads to bad outcomes for other players if they act contrary to your interests. So an example of this is, oh, no, you're not allowed to see that. Player A says that they will use the +4 card only if player B skips them, right? A promise is a response rule that leads to good outcomes for other players who act in ways that promote your interests. So an example of this in Uno is player A says that if player B doesn't use a skip, then player A will use a color change card to make the color into something more favorable for player B, right? Suppose player B just has a handful of reds and the color is yellow at the moment. So player A says, hey, don't be mean to me and I'll make it red for it to be easier for you, right? So whenever a conditional strategic move is made, remember, you can't stop at one sentence. So every conditional strategic move is a mix of threats and promises, right? So let's go back to I'm going to soften the Pokemon card example just a bit. If you steal my Pokemon cards, I'm going to punch you. Let's just say that. Let's not use the mildly grotesque other one. So the implied sentence there is if you steal my Pokemon cards, I'm going to punch you. But there's that is a threat, right? But there's also an implied promise. If you don't steal my Pokemon cards, I won't punch you, right? So what are some examples of conditional strategic moves? If you have one, try to include all parts of it. So, if you do this, I'll do that. But if you don't do this, I won't do that, or something of the sort. So, yeah, in this example, yeah. It's pretty good not being punched in the face. Um, so sometimes yes, but sometimes no. Again, it depends really on the game. Um, it could be just not doing a bad thing, or it might be doing an expressly good thing. It depends on the game. In real life, it's very often just promise of not a bad thing. And it's also very often a good thing for both people. It just depends. What's your, it still no makes sense, but okay. What's the problem? What are you having trouble with specifically?
Like a promise is basically saying that if you do something or don't do something, then you get something good.
Yeah.
The threat saying if you do something or don't do something, they'll do something bad to you.
Yeah.
So can the promise or the good thing that the other person gets just be, oh, you don't get a bad thing, that's your good thing?
You found the hole in the logic. Exactly. This is a very, this is one of the things in game theory that's a bit of a wishy-washy definition. So yeah, sometimes there is a bit of overlap, and in which case, what do you call it? Who knows? It's that's a yeah. This is one of the more, less definite things in game theory, and it annoys me too. So don't worry. Yeah. Yeah, voices helped me a lot. You can state questions a lot easier. Go ahead if you want to. I'm not going to force you. It's your choice. So, are there any? Let's return back to this. Does anybody else have any examples of like threats and promises, just to make sure everybody understands? Because this, it's a bit weird, but still, you know, it can get it. It gets kind of important if you go on in game theory. Not uber important, but yep. If you win this, I'm not going to read the full thing because that's a bit mean. But yeah, if you the example, if you recall back to one of my earlier examples, if you win this game of chess, I'm going to punch you. That's a pretty good example of a threat, right? And that's a very good example of a promise, right? If you lose, which is good for me, I'll make it worth your time and give you a lot of money, right? If you give me a metal resource card right now, I will pay you 2 sheep resource cards within 3 rounds in Catan. That's a good example of a promise. And again, there's an assumed threat, or not really. The threat is kind of, in this case, the threat isn't really a threat. It's more like a non-thing. Like, if you don't do that, I'm not going to do this for you. Or maybe you could make it more of a threat. Like, if you don't give me your metal resource, I'm going to use my knight card or something. So bribes are strategic moves in reality. Yeah. You say, hey, do this for me before the thing starts, right? Bribes are a very good example of strategic moves, right? Say, hey, if you do this to help me out later on, I'm going to give you some money. Bribes are a very good example. Yeah. So yeah, I'm going to move on. So here's an example. So you can threaten someone by saying that you will deck them. I assume that means to hurt them, right? It's been a, yeah, it does totally. Yeah, if you deck just means to punch someone, right? That's not even like a weird language. It's just something I don't know. Yeah, it's just a really hard. Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, if you do some, if you threaten, yeah, if you take my, if you don't give me your lunch money, I'm gonna punch you, for example. Or in boxing, yeah. Wow. So anyway, so we have the United States and Japan, and they are either going to open their markets to the public or close their markets to the public, right? So if both the United States and Japan open their markets, then the U.S. and Japan, U.S. gets a payoff of 3, and Japan gets a payoff of 3. If Japan closes their markets but the United States opens, then Japan gets a payoff of 4, and the United States gets a payoff of 3, and you can read the rest. So let's first start off with the United States not making a threat, right? And we'll get into the threat a bit later. So so in this game table, we can determine that the payoff, the Nash equilibrium, is Japan closes their market and the United States opens their market. So the United States notices that they can actually do better here, right? So if the United States can somehow coerce Japan into opening their markets, they'll get a payoff of 4, right? So what does the United States do? What kind of threats will what kind of promises will the United States make? Um, yeah, so you guys are getting it, but remember, there's also the second half to that. That's the threat, but what's the promise, right? So both Ethan, yeah. Yeah, if you open, we open. Exactly, yeah. So now the United States makes their threat, right? Japan, if you decide to close our market, we're going to close our market. So remember, 1, 2, 1, 2. But if you open your market, we're also going to open our market. So 4, 3. So Japan sees this and notices that they'll either get a payoff of 3 or payoff of 2. So they're probably going to open their markets and get a payoff of 2. So now the United States chooses between a threat and a promise, right? I mean, either threatening or not threatening. So which one is the United States going to do? They can either, if they don't get a threat, they get a payoff of 3. If they do threaten, then they get a payoff of 4. So yeah, obviously they're going to threaten. Yeah. So any questions about that? So is nuke bad? So the reason we can't really talk about that is, I mean, the U.S. could do that, but remember, in the United States and Japan, in real life, if the United States just out of the blue threatened to nuke someone, then the United States would probably, get a lot of countries would also probably threaten them. Yeah, it's not very diplomatic. So yeah. And again, and another thing, if the U.S. threatens to nuke Japan, but then they don't, suddenly the United States has lost a bunch of credibility, right? So then, if other trade disputes like this occur, and the United States uses the nuclear option again, countries won't believe them because they remember that they did this to Japan, and Japan didn't. So we understand that Japan is pretty mad, right? Like, we could have gotten a payoff of 4, but we only got a payoff of 3. How could we have stopped this from happening, right? Well, we can do it. And the secret is to just read Sun Tzu's Art of War a lot. Just read it a lot. That's the secret answer. But let's get a bit more specific. So the four main ways of doing it are irrationality, cutting off communication, leaving backup plans, and salami tactics. And salami tactics does not deal with the nice sausage salami. Yeah, I'm also getting hungry by this, but I have some beef jerky right beside me. So when I'm done with this, I'm going to be having that. So what do each of these do, right? So irrationality is pretty obvious, right? But it's a bit counterintuitive why it works. So let's go over it. So the US has just thrown in Japan saying, if you close our markets, we'll also close our markets. But if you open your markets, then we'll also open our markets. So Japan then can simply say, if we are given that choice, we will choose to close our markets just out of spite, right? So suddenly the United States sees that if Japan follows through with this irrational plan, again, the important thing is credibility, they notice that they are going to get a payoff of, let's go back, they'll go back. So the United States makes the threat, and then Japan says that they're going to act irrationally and get the payoff of 1. So the United States, knowing this, does not choose to threaten them, and instead goes for the 3-4, right? So cutting off communication. So remember, what are the two things that a strategic move needs to work, right? Who remembers this? Let's just make sure that everybody remembers these two important things. Exactly, irreversibility and credibility, exactly. So, that's two of them, but there's, you're forgetting, like credibility is kind of its own separate thing, but the two are irreversibility and one more, right? Let's remember the chicken example, observability, exactly. So if you cut off communication, suddenly Japan can't see what's going on, right? So suppose the United States makes the threat, but before they make the threat, Japan just says, nah, we are not listening to whatever you say. So in that case, the Japan would choose the option that they believe before the threat. So Japan doesn't know a threat exists, right? So they're going to choose closed to get their Nash equilibrium. So the United States knows this, right? They know that if they choose the threat, because Japan assumes that there is no threat, that they are going to close. So instead, the United States will choose not to threaten, and then Japan will choose close, and the United States will choose open. So we're in the halfway point of these. Does everybody understand both the irrationality and cutting off communication? Because the next two are kind of strange. Those two are kind of similar, but the other two are a bit weird. So people keep on talking Japanese in the chat, which is interesting because remember, observability, right? I don't know what that says. It makes sense, but the chart is confusing. Yeah, the chart's a bit, let me, if we can, the first slide. So, right. When I go back and forth, just forget about the arrows, I guess. It's a bit of a weird chart. It's another one I stole from the textbook, and sometimes, again, the textbook's kind of weird. Speaking of textbook, speaking of the textbook, in our ed page, I linked the Amazon page for the textbook. Don't buy it without talking to whoever you would talk about this kind of thing with, because buying textbooks off of Amazon is uber expensive because the textbook market's just dumb. So yeah, I would recommend sampling it and then maybe renting it instead of buying it, because it's like $100 for a textbook, right? I found a nice PDF thing. So yeah, we don't, textbooks are honestly a scam. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, but anyway, everybody understand irrationality and cutting off communication and how it works. Yes, yes, yeah. All right, we're good. Let's talk about the next two things, which are a lot weirder. So leaving up backup plans. So this one isn't like both irrationality and cutting off communication are pretty easily to represent in a game. right? Just like in our nice chart, like, oh, what do they do here? But leaving backup plans and salami tactics are kind of hard to like come up with a nice, simple way of stating them. But they're also the more like intuitive, I guess. So let's go over them. So leaving backup plans. So if Japan knows that the United States is going to screw them over, right? So what Japan does is that they Japan decides to create a backup plan. So if the US does create a threat, what do we do? So Japan decides that, okay, so while we might cut off trade with the United States, we leave a backup idea to trade with some other country, right? If we can't trade with the US, we'll trade with somewhere else. It's really that simple, you know? And, you know, that's not super easy to represent in our country. I mean, not our country, our chart, I cannot talk because, you know, no other countries exist here and we're pretending it's two players. So it's harder to represent. But in real life, backup plans are pretty easy to come up with, right? In a real life example, if somebody's like threatening you and they're like, give me all your lunch money, otherwise I'll punch you, that's the threat. Then your backup plan is you leave extra money in your like locker or something. I don't know how many of you have lockers. Just carry extra cash, right? What does that mean? Is that with regards to the game theory or the rampant Japanese going on in the chat? Okay. Also, let's keep it down on the Japanese just because I don't know if somebody has a question or something. So yeah. So that's what leaving a backup plan is. So now we have salami tactics, which are probably the coolest sounding one, but the least interesting one in reality. So this one is even harder to apply to our previous example. And so let's consider two examples. So there, and then let's consider an example without the Japan-US, and then let's consider an example with the Japan-US, because the Japan-US version of this is kind of weird and it requires some weird stuff. So suppose some kid and his dad are right beside a lake, but the dad doesn't want the kid getting in the river because it's, you know, he doesn't want him getting wet because it's not fun to drive a wet person in a car. So the dad says, okay, don't get in the lake. Yeah, we're doing salami tactic. So the dad says, don't get in the lake, otherwise I'm going to do something. I'm going to take away your Pokemon cards. So the kid clearly, that's a threat, and that's a threat. And, you know, there's an implied promise of as long as you don't get in the lake, I'm not going to take your Pokemon cards. So the reason salami tactics are called salami tactics is because, you know, with salami, as you can see with these pictures, you cut them into very thin slices, right? And this is the strangest reasoning for why something is called something. But the idea is to get the threat and to like slim it down into smaller and smaller pieces of the thing. So in this case, you know, the child says, okay, I'm not going into the lake, but I'm going to dip my feet in there. That's not getting in the lake. So the child puts his feet in there, right? So suddenly the child has still kind of gotten in the lake, but because it can't really be considered that he got into the lake, the dad won't get mad, right? So, and you know, the child might continue to push his luck. Maybe he gets in, you know, a bit deeper up to his ankles or something, and then he goes deeper, and he sees until what point the dad starts to get, you know, a bit, you know, you're getting a bit too close or something, at which point he stops and, you know, gets out of the lake. So there are there counters to salami tactics. I'm going to talk about countering the counters, but it's, yeah. So let's go back to our Japan-US example, right? So in this case, there are only two options, right, for both United States and Japan. They can either open or close. But the way that Japan could use salami tactics is by just partially opening the markets, or, you know, maybe there's some degree, you know, maybe it's not completely open, completely closed. Maybe they restrict it slightly, maybe they restrict it more, and they keep on doing it smaller and smaller such that the United States doesn't consider that the Japan has closed their markets, for example, right? So how do we counter strategic move counters, right? So it's not super trivial, but the easiest way to do it is to simply redefine your threat, right? Or because, so irrational, I have no idea what that was. Uh, so there's no real way to counter irrationality, because I mean the best way to counter a lot of these is to simply do what they say, because otherwise you're going to get slam dunked on. Because, you know, as we said with irrationality, if Japan, the U.S. can't really do anything with the irrationality. If they threaten them, then Japan is going to, you know, slam dunk on them. But if they don't threaten, then it's okay for both of them, right? Because 3-4. So the United States, okay, so that there's no exact way to counter irrationality. Same with cutting off communication. Cutting off communication is, you can't really counter that. You can't force somebody to talk to you, really, right? I mean, you can kind of, but not particularly well. You can just say, no, I'm not listening, right? So there are a few ways to counter the next two. Remember, because, well, irrationality and cutting off communication are pretty rock solid. Leaving backup plans and salami tactics are a bit more loosey-goosey, I guess. I haven't used that word in like God, who knows how long. So the easy way to counter leaving up backup plans is to just shut down the backup plans, right? Japan says, okay, I'll trade with somebody else. The United States says, no, you aren't going to do that because I got this country, other countries' help, so they're not going to help you out if you try to create a backup plan. And a way to counter salami tactics is just be incredibly strict, right? So let's go back to our kid and the dad by the lake. The dad says, don't get in the lake. And then the kid tries to dip in his feet. That the dad just says, no, that counts. I'm taking away your computer with all of the things, right? Immediately, right? So that's the easiest way to counter salami tactics. So any questions about anything at all? Strategic moves, about other stuff? Can you counter for the counter strategic moves? You can go however far you want, really, but it gets more wishier and washier as you counter more and more stuff. Now the question is it really called dihydrogen monoxide? It's been a while since I took chem. I'm pretty sure it is, but is that one of those things? You don't name, yeah, I know what water is. I know it's H2O, but I'm wondering if it's dihydrogen monoxide or if it's just like the naming conventions in chemistry are super weird and I don't like them. So is the threat like I'm going to throw in your computer in the lake? Well, you have to create like a thing before that, right? So like, why would, like, if you get in the lake, I'm throwing your computer in with you, but as long as you don't get in the lake, your computer is safe, for example, right? That's an example of strategic move because it includes both the threat and the promise. If you don't give me your locker money, then I will spray you with CO2. That's a good example, but again, there's the implied promise. If you do give me your money, then I won't spray you with CO2. So yeah. Anything final? Otherwise, we're going to end like 5 minutes early. What if how much you go in the lake is how much your computer gets dipped? That's a good example of countering salami tactics, right? So the kid says, hee, I'm just going to get in the lake a little bit. And then the dad says, okay, I'm going to dip your MacBook Air in the computer that much. And I mean, computers don't even like a tiny bit of water, so it's probably going to fizzle out. So yeah, that's actually a pretty okay way to counter salami tactic. Do not hydro dip your computer. So yeah. So yeah, any final questions? Anything at all about anything we covered today, or anything we covered some previous classes? Then you come up with, if the computer is waterproof, then what? Then you create a different threat. All right, you can talk. You don't have to ask for permission to speak. Don't worry, you can do the thing. Wait, do you have to? Okay, so I'm going to assume
Please.
I'm going to assume we're done. Yeah. Why do we keep on talking about Pokemon cards? I have no idea. Anyway, so I assume we're done now. So let me stop share. So tomorrow's our last class. I actually thought this class would run short, but we're pretty much done anyway. So not tomorrow, Friday. What? Not Friday, Saturday, whatever. I keep on. No, tomorrow. We're not tomorrow. Saturday. Thank you. And Saturday is about my least favorite topic. Uncertainty and information. Remember, information imbalance, that's what we're talking about. It's not fun. I mean, it is fun. It's just not my favorite thing. The actual lesson is probably going to go on for not a whole lot. It's not Friday. I know for a fact it's Saturday. Sorry about that. That was a mix-up. But we're going to be talking about after the actual lesson is done, which it's probably going to run a little bit short, but then after that, I'm going to talk about further things to do in game theory. I accidentally unplugged my headphones. So yeah, that's what we'll talk about Saturday. So I hope everybody has a good day and tomorrow, and I'll see you on Saturday.